All right, I have a first-time guest to our show, and I'm excited to have him on. Let me do an introduction. This is Winslow Wheeler. He has spent over 40 years working on national security, defense budgets, and military reform for both political parties in the U.S. Senate and in the Government Accountability Office and the Center of Defense Information. I met him through Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and it's my privilege to have him on the show today. Winslow, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to talk to you.
Yeah. So your areas of study and expertise are national security, the U.S. defense budget, the U.S. military, and the reform in order to have a strong military. So I definitely want to stick to your strengths, but at the same time, I want to ask questions that people bring to me to really try to understand our country, our Senate, our military. When Bernie Sanders ran for president, wasn't he the person that the military contractors were putting the most money behind?
Yeah. During that campaign, I put out a message that according to the data at one of the more important websites on political contributions, that Bernie Sanders had gotten more from the defense industry than any other Democratic candidate. I didn't track how long that was the case. I'm sure there are lots of phone calls being made after that became known that Bernie Sanders was doing better from the defense industry than Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or others. But it was remarkable.
Why do you think that they would throw so much money behind his presidency? Isn't he like an anti-war, pro-worker candidate? I mean, I know he's not running anymore, so I don't want to spend too much time, but when I read that, I was shocked how much money they gave to him.
Access. They would like to have a meeting, and the way the system works on Capitol Hill, you want to have a meeting, well, yeah, we can do that. It's very unspoken, but your chances of getting a meeting with the member rather than just staff are a lot better if there's been some money put into the till.
So I wonder if they were throwing money at him because they believed he was going to win. And they were, like you say, lining up their opportunity to meet with him by putting in the donation to get him elected. That may have had something to do with it.
Well, the way the logic runs, yes, it's a useful contingency. You know that because of his politics, Bernie Sanders is never going to publicly embrace you, but you want access. You want to be able to talk to him directly or to him through his staff. And that's the way the defense industry thinks in terms of, well, we need to talk to this guy, so let's throw some money at him. That's not always, it's not always the case that you need to throw money to have a meeting, but that's certainly the way the system thinks.
It tends to grease the wheels in the direction you want, at least. Our mutual friend, Colonel Macgregor, has said many times that many members of Congress hide behind the U.S. military, meaning they rely on them instead of diplomacy. They rely on them to get reelected. Do you think this money that was given to Bernie Sanders to get access, do you think the military-industrial complex has put forward this kind of buying access money to most members of Congress?
Oh, for sure, yeah. You'd be a pretty strange member of Congress if you didn't get at least some money from the defense corporations. It's universal or near universal. I'm not aware of a single member who rejects all forms of defense corporation spending, including when it's buried inside PACs. Lots of them pretend their noses are clean because they don't accept money from the corporate PACs. They don't point out that they do accept money from larger PACs where the title is not Lockheed Martin, but let's help America. And it's impossible to tell in those in the in most of the financial data just who's giving that money. But you can be very safe in saying there's a lot of defense money in there. Our system doesn't require that all forms of disclosure be made about just who gave that politician that money.
Interesting.
They like it that way.
Kind of a backdoor.
That's both Republicans and Democrats, liberals, moderates, and conservatives. Don't think that because some man or woman in Congress is a good guy in your head, that he or she doesn't take lots of this money, both the dark money and the corporate money.
I have learned that over the years is that both sides are playing similar games. The United States military spends more money than the next 10 countries combined. Is the United States obsessed with war, or is it just very expensive to be the policeman of the world? Why is our military budget so much bigger than the rest of the countries out there?
Well, there's sort of two questions there. One is, what does the money get spent on? And two, why do we spend at such high levels? We've been an aggressor nation for decades, sticking our nose into conflicts, intervening, provoking wars. There's nothing new about that. The classic example, of course, is George W. Bush in the Second Iraq War in 2003, actively fomented by his administration, his Secretary of Defense, his Vice President, on false pretexts. That's not the only example. Take, for example, the war we're now very concerned about, the war in Ukraine. To say, the meme in Washington is that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked. That's total horseshit. We've been expanding NATO despite constant warnings from Putin that at some point this is going to become unacceptable to them. The simplest analogy is to reverse the picture and talk about whether China were aligning itself with Mexico, for example, and beginning to deploy weapon systems, radars, missile systems in Mexico. What would we think about that? Well, we know from the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 that we regard that as an intolerable provocation. We've been doing this to Russia since 1996, when presidential candidate Bill Clinton wanted to shore up his ethnic base in the Midwest and started advocating for NATO expansion, even though the vast majority of national security experts back then said that's a bad idea. You're going to gratuitously provoke the Russians. This kept on proceeding right up to Russia's border in the Baltic states and Poland. And we've been enticing Ukraine to want to be in NATO ever since the Obama administration provoked a coup in Ukraine over, to unseat the pro-Russian democratically elected government there, started some fighting in the Russian-speaking districts in southeastern Ukraine. And here we are. There have been other provocations, such as the Aegis Ashore missile systems in Poland, Romania, that the Russians said they'd like to be able to inspect those, and make sure those canisters aren't also carrying offensive weapons rather than just defensive air defense anti-missile systems. We, of course, refuse to allow them that. There's a series of provocations, and finally, in 2021, 2022, Putin made it clear that he wanted to yet again negotiate over these issues, and Biden told him to go, put it where the sun doesn't shine. And here we are.
Yeah.
But so to get back to your question, we do these things all over the world. We stick our nose into other countries. We provoke conflicts. That creates a constituency both on Capitol Hill and in the country at large for a larger defense budget. As I think you've pointed out, our defense, if you just count Pentagon spending, we spend as much as the next 10 nations internationally. The Chinese defense budget is these days about a third of ours. The Russian defense budget is about a sixth of ours. So one gets the impression that the Chinese, for example, are getting a lot more for their buck than we are. The truth is, we don't know what we're getting. The simple answer to that question is the fact that the Pentagon is unable to pass an audit. They've tried for 3 or 4 years now, and they constantly fail. The important thing to note is that it doesn't just flunk an audit. It's a little bit more problematic than that. The Pentagon is split up into 27 auditable entities. About half of them, about a third of them were able to be audited. The other 2/3, it wasn't that they flunked an audit. It was that they couldn't be audited. You flunk an audit when you track the money and you find out that it was not spent as intended. You can't be audited when you can't figure out where the hell the money went. In other words, it would be a vast improvement of our accountability in the Pentagon if those 2/3 of those 27 Defense Department entities were able to flunk an audit. It would imply that we are able to track the money.
So it's so bad they can't even get to the point where they can flunk an audit.
Correct.
Okay.
And even the parts that pass the audit, it's a very superficial audit. It's called a statement of budgetary resources and an inventory check. A statement of budgetary resources is analogous to balancing your checkbook. Yes, that the check got cashed. Lockheed Martin cashed the check, that $80-90 billion they got for acquisition. The money's gone and it's all been spent. However, you get no insights into how Lockheed Martin actually spent that money, whether their overhead allocations were fair and reasonable, whether their profits were fair and reasonable. You don't have a clue. It's every year or so, we see a GAO report on improper defense corporation payments. Most of those GAO reports are based on what the corporations told the Pentagon. Oh, gee, here's a couple $1 million back. We didn't actually need it. That's what the defense corporations are saying. That's not what some independent objective auditor is saying. We have a very long ways to go to understand how that money is really being spent. That said, we already can tell ourselves that a lot of it is being spent extremely poorly. My favorite example is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. It's replacing the F-16, the F-18, the A-10, and to some extent the F-15. All of those 4 airplanes were very successful designs. The F-35 is very clearly a failed design. It's too complex. It's too expensive. The major reason being its complexity. It's too unreliable because of its complexity. It is not able to get into the air very often. U.S. Air Force records on its version of the F-35 show that it gets into the air 2, maybe 3 times a week. And that's getting worse, not better. We recently saw an accident report from the United Kingdom about its loss of an F-35B, the version that takes off and lands vertically. It failed to properly take off from a UK aircraft carrier because somebody didn't extract a pad that was put over the inlet for on one side of the jet intakes, and it flopped off the aircraft carrier. The after action report showed that of the 12 F-35s on that aircraft carrier, 9 of them were incapable of flight. They were non-mission capable. 3 of them were mission capable, including the one that crashed. However, the term mission capable means that you're able to fly one of the types of missions you are designated for. And interestingly, that F-35B that tried to take off and crashed into the sea was incapable of being refueled in the air. So its range was quite short, and we don't know what other F-35 missions it was incapable of performing, but it was mission capable.
Do you know off the top of your head how much those F-35 jets cost?
$80 million for an F-35A. And on top of that, all the costs of the various forms of support. It comes out at about $125 million.
That's $125 million a jet, and 9 of the 12 didn't work.
Correct. And that does not include the basic R&D for the airplane. Add that, and you get up to about $160 million per airplane. Wow. what that kind of cost means is that you can't buy enough of them to replace the inventory of F-16s, F-18s, A-10s, etc. At a rate at which those airplanes are retiring because of age. And it literally means that as you buy new F-35s, our fighter inventory is on average aging. And because of the you're retiring more airplanes than you're buying, our inventory is also shrinking because the F-35 costs multiples of F-16s or A-10s, for example, to maintain. That means that your costs there are a factor of 2 or 3. But sometimes the Air Force, for example, doesn't like to pay all those bills. And as a result, a lot of that maintenance isn't done. And therefore, you have spare part shortages for the F-35A. And because the airplane is so expensive to operate and it's unavailable most of the time, pilots can't get up in the air to train. In the Reagan years, it wasn't great, but Air Force pilots would get about 20 hours in the air per month to train. F-35 pilots these days get about 6 to 8 hours per month in the air to train.
Wow. I would have thought it would be per day.
You'd think that, but no. And what we're talking about is third world levels of pilot expertise. We for a long time prided ourselves on doing our pilots right by getting them lots of in the air time for exercises and training. We're about a third of where we should be in time in terms of hours per month that pilots are able to train, and they just can't give themselves the skills they need to deal with an enemy that has a real air force. Remember, since for the last 20, 30 years, we've been picking fights, but only with opponents that don't have an air force, for example. And so you don't really know how well our pilots today would do against North Vietnamese or North Korean pilots, let alone Chinese or Russian pilots. This is a real problem. And we're not doing anything to fix it. You'll get horror stories from the Pentagon each year about, we're having all these readiness problems. We need more money. Please send more money. And Congress always, falls for it, sends more money. But guess where the money isn't spent? It's not spent on getting those in the air hours fixed. It's not spent on getting the depots up to speed on complete maintenance for the airplanes. And it's not just the Pentagon that's sitting on its hands in that regard. It's Congress too. Each year I go through the final product of the defense spending that Congress enacts, and you see billions of dollars, not millions, billions of dollars taken out of the operation and maintenance budget, the budget that pays for training, spare parts, maintenance, depots, etc. They take billions out of that account and put it into R&D and procurement accounts for congressional add-ons, otherwise known as earmarks of war. So we've got a lot of bad players in this in this operation. They're not all in the Pentagon. There's plenty of them on Capitol Hill, and those behaviors are not changing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sitting here, Winslow, thinking, well, no wonder we don't want to give away F-16 jets and training and ground crew and all of that. We're not even prepared ourselves. How are we going to do it for another nation that, you know, would have to learn English and leave the war zone in order to go learn all of this? This kind of terrifying, actually, to think about the unpreparedness if a bigger, more capable enemy were to come at us.
Yeah, 2 points. You keep on hearing baloney in congressional speeches about ours being the best military in the world. They have no basis for saying that. It's impossible to say exactly how we would compare to the Russians, the Chinese, let alone the North Koreans or whoever else, or the Iranians. But we've let our readiness deteriorate so much that it's a fool's errand to think that we had the so-called best military in the world. We don't. Also, I should say that those F-16s are going to be going to Ukraine. They're coming out of Europe. But even if they were to come out of the U.S., oh, wonderful. Well, let's replace those F-16s. Guess what? We replace them with F-35s.
Oh gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh, this has been as terrifying as it is fascinating.